The Morgan mansion plunged into absolute stillness. Not from any violent outburst, not from someone collapsing, but because someone had just committed an act nobody had dared contemplate for 3 entire years. Standing beneath a crystal chandelier valued at several $1 million, Victoria Sterling, the stunning fiancée of Los Angeles' wealthiest billionaire, raised her hand with icy determination, preparing to strike an elderly servant just as she had done countless times before. Time seemed to freeze. The household staff, the security team, the head butler, even individuals who had witnessed terrible things without flinching held their collective breath. They knew exactly what was coming. Victoria always lashed out when anger consumed her. Today, fury controlled every movement she made. Then something unexpected occurred. A slender, pale hand intercepted her wrist. Not timidly, not with trembling uncertainty, but with the unwavering strength of someone who had learned to stand firm against any storm. The new housekeeper, Emma, a quiet young woman who had only been employed for 3 days, stopped her. So gaunt she appeared almost fragile, the type of person you'd never expect to meet anyone's eyes, much less grab the billionaire's fiancé by the wrist in front of the entire staff. Yet there she stood, gripping Victoria's raised arm, refusing to release it. Jaws dropped throughout the room. "How dare you? Do you have any idea what you're doing?" Victoria's scream echoed off the walls, her entire frame shaking with shock. Emma maintained her hold. Her grip remained steady. Her expression stayed eerily calm, the look of someone who had endured so much torment that fear had become a foreign concept. What nobody realized was that Jackson Morgan himself, the most influential billionaire in Los Angeles, stood just beyond the doorway in the hallway. He paused. The screaming reached his ears. Slowly his head turned. Then he witnessed everything unfolding. His fiancée was about to assault an elderly worker and a frail, pale housekeeper was preventing it. Jackson didn't move forward. He didn't utter a single word. He simply observed, his gaze cold as winter frost, until something unusual flickered behind his eyes. Because in 3 years nobody had ever challenged Victoria. Not once. The words Victoria shouted next sent tremors through everyone present. "Release me immediately. Let go this instant. Do you comprehend who I am?" Emma's hand didn't waver even slightly. That single moment would alter everything forever. Then a collective gasp rippled through the space because something even more shocking transpired. Victoria attempted to yank her arm away but couldn't. Her face flushed crimson. Her eyes went wide with disbelief. She struggled with more force. Still useless. Everyone stared at the new housekeeper in stunned amazement. Where could such a thin woman have discovered that kind of strength? Jackson watched from the darkness, his eyes narrowing dangerously. He thought silently, "What kind of person have I brought into my household?" Just as he prepared to step forward, someone else entered behind him. Someone who shouldn't have been there. Someone whose mere presence was sufficient to drain all color from Victoria's complexion. But before we discover their identity, we must travel backward through time. 15 years into the past. To a storm-drenched night in the Detroit slums. To a 13-year-old boy lying half dead in a spreading pool of blood. To the little girl who rescued his life. Because everything that transpired in that grand room today had its origins long ago, far before Emma ever walked through the Morgan estate gates. Long before Victoria ever heard Jackson Morgan's name. If you want to learn what terrifying secret awaits, please tap like to support the channel. Share this video with anyone who cherishes emotion-filled stories. Don't forget to subscribe and activate notifications so you won't miss the most unexpected revelations. Detroit 15 years earlier, a rain-soaked November night. 13-year-old Jackson Morgan lay curled in a dark passage behind a deteriorating apartment complex. Blood flowed from 3 stab wounds piercing his body. One penetrated his stomach, another his chest, the third his back. Rain hammered down as though the heavens themselves wept. Yet it couldn't wash away the expanding pool of blood beneath him. He didn't shed tears. He'd forgotten how years ago. It had begun with his father, a pathetic man enslaved by alcohol and gambling. He owed substantial sums to a gang controlling the slums. Not small amounts, massive debts, so enormous they'd exhausted their patience. That evening 3 men invaded the miserable apartment the two shared. They demanded immediate payment. His father collapsed to his knees and pleaded, but pleading couldn't purchase food. Pleading certainly couldn't eliminate a debt. If you lack the money, your son pays the price instead. Jackson remembered those words, merciless, brutal, without a hint of hesitation. Then the blade pierced him. The first strike, the second, the third, he didn't even have opportunity to scream. He only experienced pain, excruciating pain, as if someone was shredding his body into pieces. His father howled but took no action. He simply stood there trembling, watching his son crumple. "This serves as a lesson," one of the men stated flatly. "Next week, if there's no payment, the kid dies." They departed, abandoning Jackson in his own blood. His father left too. Jackson had no idea where he went, perhaps to hide, perhaps to drink, perhaps to search for more borrowed money. But he didn't transport Jackson to any hospital. He didn't contact emergency services. He simply disappeared into the darkness as if Jackson had never existed at all. Jackson dragged himself forward inch by agonizing inch. Blood dripped in a long trail across the freezing concrete. He crawled past the stairwell, crawled through the corridor, crawled into the alley behind the structure. Then he collapsed completely. Nothing remained within him to give. Rain pounded his face, biting and cold, but he couldn't register the cold anymore. He only felt exhaustion, so utterly exhausted he wanted to close his eyes and never open them. Perhaps dying would be preferable, he thought. Does anybody even care? His mother had abandoned them when he was small. His father had never shown him love. He had no friends, no family, nobody. 13 years old, dying in a dark alley, and nobody knew. Jackson closed his eyes. He heard the rain. He heard water gurgling through the drain. He heard his heartbeat growing weaker and weaker, fainter and fainter. Is this how my life ends? He wondered, alone in the darkness like some stray animal. He didn't feel bitterness. He was too drained for bitterness. He only wanted it to conclude quickly, quietly. But just as he thought he was about to sink into permanent darkness, a voice rang out, small, trembling, yet clear. "Hey, hey, are you all right?" Jackson tried to open his eyes. Everything was blurred, but he distinguished a figure standing above him, small, thin, drenched by the rain, a little girl. She knelt beside him. Her eyes were wide, frightened, but she didn't flee. She pressed her hand against his chest, feeling the faint, struggling rhythm of his heart. "Don't die," she said, her voice shaking. "Do you hear me? Don't you dare die." Jackson wanted to speak, but couldn't. His lips moved. No sound emerged. The girl didn't hesitate. She acted, and what she did next transformed Jackson's life forever. The girl's name was Emma, 13 years old. So thin she looked nearly ill. Light brown hair plastered against her head by the downpour. Ancient torn clothing soaked through. Slung across her shoulder was a burlap sack filled with empty cans and plastic bottles. She'd been collecting recyclables when she heard a faint moan from the dark passage. Anyone else would have run. The Detroit slums at night weren't a place for curiosity. But Emma didn't run. She stepped closer and discovered Jackson. "Oh my God," she breathed when she saw all the blood. So much blood. She didn't scream, she didn't panic. She moved quickly and decisively, as though accustomed to facing whatever life threw her way. Emma tossed the sack aside. She slipped off the thin jacket she wore, her only protection against the cold, rain-soaked night. Without hesitation, she tore it into long strips. Then she dropped to her knees beside Jackson. "You have to survive," she said, her voice trembling though her hands stayed steady. "Do you hear me? You have to survive." She wrapped the cloth tightly around the wound in Jackson's stomach, pulled hard. Jackson groaned in agony, but Emma didn't stop. She continued, binding the wound in his chest, then the one in his back. Blood soaked through the fabric almost instantly, but at least the flow slowed. "I'm getting you there, hang on." Jackson wanted to tell her she couldn't. She was too small, too thin, and he weighed considerably more than she did, but he couldn't force the words out. He could only stare at her through eyes already dimming. Emma didn't care about logic. She slid her arms under Jackson's, hauled him upward. He was heavy, so incredibly heavy, but she clenched her teeth, braced herself, and dragged him forward one step at a time. The rain continued pounding. The ground was slick. Emma fell. She got up. She dragged Jackson again. She fell again. She stood again, over and over, over and over. "The clinic," she panted. "Just 2 blocks more. Stay with me." Jackson didn't understand how he was still alive. Maybe because the girl wouldn't permit him to die. Maybe because those thin arms kept pulling him forward, refusing to abandon him. In the middle of the street when Jackson was nearly gone, she began to sing. Her voice was small, shaking, nearly swallowed by the rain, but Jackson could still hear it. "Hush, little baby, don't say a word. Mama's gonna buy you a mockingbird." It was a lullaby, but she sang the words incorrectly. Near the end, instead of singing it properly, she sang, "And if that horse and cart fall down, you'll still be the sweetest little baby in town." Wrong, completely wrong, but Jackson didn't care. That voice kept him conscious. That voice gave him something to cling to. Finally, they reached the clinic. Emma kicked the door and cried out, "Help, please help." Everything afterward turned into chaos. People rushed forward. People shouted. They lifted Jackson onto a stretcher. Someone contacted an ambulance. Before Jackson was wheeled away, the girl grabbed his hand. From her own wrist, she slipped off a bracelet braided from red thread. Old, frayed, but she placed it in Jackson's palm as if it were the most precious treasure in existence. "Keep it," she said, her eyes rimmed red. "It'll bring you luck." Jackson forced his mouth to move. "What's your name?" His voice was raw, almost no sound at all. The girl smiled, a sad smile, but warm. "Call me Star," she said, "because I like looking at the stars." Then the stretcher rolled away. Jackson tried to turn his head to look back at her, but his vision was too blurred and his consciousness was slipping into darkness. 3 days later, Jackson woke in the hospital. He lay on white sheets wrapped in bandages, machines beeping steadily at his side. A nurse stood nearby, checking his IV. "The boy's awake," she called out. "You're very lucky. Another minute and you might not have made it." Jackson didn't care that he was lucky. He cared about one thing. "The girl," he rasped. "The girl who brought me here, where is she?" The nurse frowned. "What girl?" "She was small, thin, light brown hair. She saved me." The nurse shook her head. "When the ambulance arrived at the clinic, you were alone. There was nobody else." Jackson's heart tightened. "That can't be. She was there. She gave me." He looked down at his hand, and he saw it, the braided red thread bracelet still there, wrapped around his wrist. So the girl had been real. She had saved him, and then she vanished. Jackson clenched the red thread, tears sliding down his cheeks. For the first time in years, he cried, not from pain, but because someone hadn't abandoned him. Because someone had torn up her own jacket in freezing rain to save a stranger. Because someone had sung to him while he was dying. "Star," he whispered, staring up at the blank white ceiling. "I'll find you. Even if it takes my entire life, I'll find you." And that vow the 13-year-old boy made, he kept for 15 years. 15 years later, Jackson Morgan was no longer the gaunt boy bleeding out in a dark alley. Now his name made all of Los Angeles recognize power. The most successful billionaire in the city, a 28-year-old man with a business empire stretching from downtown Los Angeles to San Francisco. People said that if Jackson Morgan simply nodded, a person could rise into wealth and comfort, and if he shook his head, that person could vanish without a trace. From the child abandoned by his father on a rain-soaked night, Jackson had built everything with nothing but his bare hands, with blood, with sweat, with merciless determination toward his rivals. He trusted nobody, loved nobody, forgave nobody. His heart had frozen on the night his father fled, leaving him to die. But there was one thing Jackson had kept close for 15 years, something nobody was allowed to touch, something he wore on his wrist every day and never removed. The bracelet braided from red thread. It was old and worn. The red had faded into a dusty rose, but Jackson wore it as if it were the most precious thing in the world because it was the only thing that reminded him that someone once had not abandoned him. The girl named Star. Jackson had spent millions of dollars trying to find her. He hired the best private investigators, turned hospitals upside down for records, questioned people all across the Detroit slums from back then. But nobody knew who she was. Nobody remembered a 13-year-old child collecting cans in the rain. It was as if she had never existed. 12 years passed. Jackson nearly gave up. Then 3 years ago she appeared. Victoria Sterling, 27 years old, beautiful like a painting, hair like spun gold, eyes as blue as the ocean, a smile so enchanting it could make men forget their own names. She came to Jackson with a perfect story. "I'm the one who saved you that night," Victoria said, her eyes shining with tears. "I'm your star." Jackson didn't believe her right away. He'd met too many imposters over those 12 years. People eager to exploit his gratitude, people who wanted money, power, protection from the city's most successful man. But Victoria was different. She had proof. She knew about the scar on Jackson's back. She knew about the alley behind the apartment building. She knew about the clinic 2 blocks away. She even knew the lullaby the girl had sung that night. "Hush, little baby, don't say a word." Victoria sang softly, her voice sweet as honey, and she had a bracelet braided from red thread. "This is the other one," she said. "That night I braided two, one for you, one I kept." Jackson stared at the red thread in Victoria's hand. It looked exactly like the one he wore. Old, frayed, the red faded. His heart stumbled. After 12 years of searching, had he finally found her? Jackson didn't know that Victoria had spent 2 years preparing for this moment. She hired a detective to dig into Jackson's past, bought information from people in the slums, questioned doctors and nurses from the hospital years ago. She learned everything, every smallest detail. And she had a fake red bracelet made, soaking it in tea so it would look old, as if it had truly aged for 15 years. All for one purpose: to become the fiancée of the most powerful billionaire in Los Angeles. And she succeeded. Jackson believed her. He brought her into the Morgan estate. He spoiled her like a treasure. He gave her everything she wanted. Money, jewelry, power. He even promised to marry her. Because to Jackson, Victoria wasn't only a lover. She was a savior. The only person who had not abandoned him, the angel who had pulled him back from the darkness. He had no idea he was loving an imposter. 3 years passed. The wedding was planned. The news spread everywhere. The biggest newspapers in Los Angeles ran the story of the wedding of the century. Billionaire Jackson Morgan to marry the mysterious woman who saved his life 15 years ago. Photos of Jackson and Victoria appeared on the front page. They stood side by side, Victoria smiling brilliantly, Jackson as cold as ever, yet his hand still resting lightly at her waist. That newspaper was circulated across the United States. And in a faraway small town there was a man who saw it. He stared at the photo of Victoria Sterling. His eyes turned bloodshot, his jaw clenched tight, his hand shook as he held the paper. "You," he whispered, his voice thick with hatred. "I finally found you." That man's name was Marcus Bennett, and he had a blood debt to collect from Victoria Sterling, a debt from 5 years ago, a debt with his sister's name on it. But that is a story for later. For now, inside the Morgan estate, Victoria Sterling was living the sweetest days of her life. She didn't know a storm was coming. She didn't know the past was about to knock at her door. She didn't know that in only a few weeks, a frail housekeeper named Emma would walk into this mansion and everything would fall apart. But behind that sweet smile and that flawless appearance, Victoria Sterling was someone else entirely. Whenever Jackson left the estate, her true face emerged. No more gentle voice, no more enchanting smile, no more loving eyes. In their place came cruelty, arrogance, and a viciousness she didn't even bother to hide. "You useless trash, you call this clean?" Victoria's screaming echoed through the mansion whenever Jackson was away. She hurled objects at the staff. She slapped anyone who dared to meet her gaze. She made them kneel when they spoke to her. "Look down, you don't deserve to look at my face." The servants in the Morgan estate lived in fear. They knew who Victoria really was. They knew how she treated them, but nobody dared to speak, not a single person. Because Victoria was Jackson Morgan's fiancée, the billionaire savior, the woman he loved and protected. Who would dare say a word against her? Who would accuse her? Jackson wouldn't believe it, and the consequences would be horrific. So they stayed silent. They lowered their heads. They endured. They accepted the beatings, the curses, the daily humiliation. As long as when Jackson was present, everything would be calm again. Victoria would turn sweet again and they would be safe. But there was one man who didn't stay silent, at least not entirely. William Brooks, Jackson's loyal butler, 62 years old, hair white as snow, back bent with age, yet his eyes were still sharp as blades. He had been with Jackson since Jackson was 15, newly discharged from the hospital. He watched the boy grow up, watched him build an empire, watched him become the most powerful billionaire in Los Angeles, and he loved him like his own son. That was why William couldn't look away while Victoria tormented the staff. He knew something was wrong. He'd felt it from the very first day she stepped into the estate. But he couldn't tell Jackson. Not yet. Jackson loved Victoria. He believed she was his savior, the angel who had saved his life. If William said she was a bad woman without proof, Jackson wouldn't believe him. Worse, it would break his heart. And William didn't want to hurt the child he'd raised for 13 years. So William chose to investigate quietly, carefully, without letting anyone know. He began collecting information about Victoria Sterling, about her family, her past, the years before she appeared in front of Jackson. He hired private investigators. He examined every smallest detail in the story she told. And the more he uncovered, the more he doubted. Victoria said she'd grown up in Detroit, but nobody in the slums remembered her face. She said she'd collected cans at 13, yet there were no records showing her family had ever lived there. She said she had a star-shaped birthmark behind her right ear, just like the girl from that night, but William had never seen that mark. Something didn't fit. Something was wrong, but William needed proof, hard proof, proof that couldn't be denied. He couldn't go to Jackson with nothing but vague suspicion. He needed something concrete, something that could prove Victoria Sterling was an imposter. And after 2 years of digging, he almost had it. An email. An email Victoria had sent to a private investigator 3 years earlier. In it, she asked the investigator to dig up everything about the night Jackson was stabbed. About the alley, the clinic, the lullaby, the red bracelet. If Victoria truly was the one who saved Jackson, why would she need to hire someone to investigate her own memories? William gripped the printed email in his hand. At last, he had what he needed. But before he could bring it to Jackson, everything happened. The new housekeeper named Emma walked into the Morgan estate, and everything began to change. Emma Carter was 28 years old, but her eyes were far older than her age. They were the eyes of someone who had seen too much suffering, endured too much injustice, cried too many tears until there were no tears left to cry. Her life was a long chain of tragedies. At 13, she saved a boy who was dying in a dark alley. She didn't know that one act would change both their fates. She only knew she couldn't leave a life behind when it was begging for help. At 14, her mother died. She was a woman addicted to alcohol, living on public assistance and whatever Emma could scavenge. She wasn't a good mother. She often drank herself senseless and forgot to feed Emma. But she was still the only person Emma had in the world. One night she drank too much. She suffered alcohol poisoning and never woke up again. Emma became an orphan, 14 years old. No father, no mother, no relatives, nobody. She was sent to an orphanage on the outskirts of San Diego. It wasn't hell, but it wasn't heaven either. She was bullied for being too thin, too timid, too different. The other children mocked her, called her a stick, a ghost, useless. Emma didn't fight back. She only lowered her head and endured. She was used to enduring, but in the darkness of that orphanage there was a small light. Grace, an older social worker already retired who sometimes came to volunteer. She saw Emma, saw the sadness in her eyes, saw the loneliness in every careful movement, and she decided to become Emma's foster mother. Grace wasn't rich. She lived in a small apartment on a modest pension, but she gave Emma what she had never had: love, care, a real home. 4 years with Grace were the happiest 4 years of Emma's life. At 18, Emma aged out. She had to stand on her own, earn her own living. Grace was growing frail and she couldn't support Emma forever. Emma understood. She left that small apartment with a few worn clothes and Grace's final instructions. Be kind, my girl, no matter how cruel life is to you. Over the next 10 years, Emma did every job she could find, washing dishes in restaurants, cleaning floors for the wealthy, serving drinks in bars. She worked 16 hours a day, saved every dollar, and sent what she could back to Grace. Then tragedy struck again. 3 years ago, Emma worked as a housekeeper for a wealthy family in Chicago. The lady of the house was cruel, frequently beating the staff. Emma saw it. She couldn't stay silent. She chose to speak up. It was the biggest mistake of her life. The mistress framed Emma for stealing jewelry. Emma was fired. Her name was dragged through the dirt. She was blacklisted by every employment agency. Nobody believed her. Nobody listened. She was just a poor housekeeper. And the mistress was rich and powerful. Who would stand on Emma's side? Emma lost her job, her reputation, her faith in justice, and the lesson she learned was silence. Never speak up. Never accuse anyone because nobody believes people like her. 2 months ago, Grace was diagnosed with terminal cancer. The doctor said she needed surgery immediately, then constant chemotherapy. The cost was a number Emma could never reach. She was desperate. She begged everywhere. She offered to do any work at all as long as she could earn enough to save the woman who had been a mother to her. Then she saw the job posting at the Morgan estate. Triple the usual pay, room and board included, paid weekly. Emma didn't have to think. She applied immediately and she was hired. On her first day stepping into the Morgan estate, Emma felt as if she'd walked into another world. Lavish, glittering, overwhelming. She had never seen a place so beautiful, but it wasn't the beauty of the mansion that left her rooted to the floor. It was the man coming down the staircase. Jackson Morgan, the billionaire, the owner of the estate. Emma recognized him instantly. That face, those eyes. Even after 15 years, even though he had changed from a gaunt boy into a powerful man, she still knew him. The boy she had saved in that alley so long ago, and on his wrist she saw it. The bracelet braided from red thread, worn, faded, but still there. After 15 years, he had kept it. Emma's heart slipped into a wild, uneven beat. She wanted to run to him, to tell him she was the one who had saved him, to tell him she was his star. But then she saw Victoria Sterling, the beautiful woman on Jackson's arm, the woman introduced as the boss's fiancée, the woman everyone said was the savior who had rescued Jackson all those years ago. Emma understood at once. She was an imposter, but Emma said nothing. She remembered Chicago, remembered the feeling of being framed, remembered the pain of not being believed by anyone at all. She was only a poor housekeeper. Victoria was the billionaire's fiancée. Who would believe Emma? Who would listen? What proof did she have besides her own memory? No, she wouldn't speak. She wouldn't risk losing her job while her foster mother needed money for treatment. She would stay quiet, work, earn the money, then leave. That was Emma's plan, but fate had its own designs. On the first day, Emma worked from early morning until late at night. She scrubbed floors, cleaned rooms, did laundry. She did whatever she was assigned without a single complaint. She kept her head down whenever she passed Victoria. She avoided Jackson's eyes. She tried to become invisible, to blend into the walls of the mansion. That evening, while Emma was eating in the servants' kitchen, another housekeeper sat down beside her. Her name was Jenny. She'd worked here for 2 years. "You're new, aren't you?" Jenny asked softly. Emma nodded. Jenny glanced around, making sure nobody was listening, then lowered her voice. "I'm only warning you once. Stay away from Victoria when she's in a bad mood. Don't look her in the eye. Don't speak to her unless she speaks to you. And most of all, if she wants to hit you, let her. Don't resist. Don't say a word." Emma looked at Jenny and saw the fear in the other woman's eyes. "I understand," Emma said. "Thank you." That night, Emma lay on a narrow bed in the servants' quarters, staring up at the dark ceiling. She thought about Jackson, about the red thread bracelet on his wrist, about Victoria and her lies. But she did nothing. She only closed her eyes and tried to sleep. On the second day, Emma was assigned to clean the second-floor corridor. It was a quiet area with little foot traffic. She liked that she could work alone without worrying about Victoria or anyone else. As she mopped the floor, Emma began to sing, an old habit from childhood. She sang when she worked alone. It made her feel less alone. "Hush, little baby, don't say a word. Mama's gonna buy you a mockingbird." The lullaby from long ago. The song she had sung to a dying boy in a dark alley. She still sang the last part wrong, just as she had 15 years earlier. Emma didn't know someone was standing behind her listening. William Brooks, the old butler. He stood there with his eyes wide, his heart hammering. That song, that melody, that wrong line. He'd heard Jackson mention it hundreds of times over 15 years. It was the song the girl had sung that night. The song nobody knew except Jackson and the person who saved him. Yet this new housekeeper was singing it, singing the right tune, singing the wrong part in exactly the same place. William stepped forward. Emma startled and turned. "Where did you learn that song?" he asked, his voice calm but his gaze sharp and searching. Emma felt her heart tight. I don't remember. I've known it since I was little." William studied her for a long moment, then nodded and walked away without another word. But that night he sat in his office staring at the notes he'd gathered on Victoria Sterling. Then he wrote a new line beneath them. The new housekeeper, Emma Carter, knows the lullaby, needs investigating. The third day morning, Victoria's scream rang through the mansion. "Where's my diamond ring? Who took my ring?" She stormed into the living room like a hurricane, face flushed red, eyes blazing, her finger jabbing at the trembling servants lined up before her. "Which one of you? Which one did it?" Nobody answered. Nobody dared. Then Victoria's eyes stopped on Ruth, the 60-year-old cook, the gentlest woman in the estate. "You," Victoria pointed straight at Ruth's face. "You were in my room this morning cleaning. You took my ring." Ruth trembled and shook her head. "Ma'am, I didn't take it. I swear I didn't." "Shut up." Victoria advanced. Ruth backed away, but not fast enough. Victoria lifted her hand, ready to slap the elderly cook. Everyone stood still. Nobody moved, nobody spoke, but one person didn't remain still. Emma. She stepped forward and her hand closed around Victoria's wrist. The room froze in that instant. Victoria tried to wrench her arm free, but she couldn't. Her face flushed red with anger and humiliation. She struggled harder, yet Emma's thin hand didn't let go. "Let go of me," I said. "Let go right now. Do you even know who I am?" Emma didn't answer. She simply stood there calm, her eyes holding not a single trace of fear. The eyes of someone who had endured too much to still be afraid. And then, right at that moment, a voice came from the doorway. "What's going on in here?" Everyone turned. Jackson Morgan stood at the threshold, eyes cold as ice as he took in the scene before him, his fiancée's wrist trapped in a housekeeper's grip, and the housekeeper not trembling at all. Victoria changed in an instant. She yanked her hand away from Emma, rushed to Jackson, tears gathering in her eyes. "Jackson, I was attacked by this housekeeper. She dared to lay hands on me. She needs to be fired immediately." Jackson didn't look at Victoria. He looked at Emma. The frail housekeeper stood still, her hands lowered, her head slightly bowed. She didn't defend herself, didn't explain, didn't beg. "You," Jackson said, his voice low and cold. "Why did you do that?" Emma lifted her head. Her eyes met Jackson's, and for one brief moment something passed between them. A faint, uncertain recognition, a sense of familiarity that made no sense and yet wouldn't go away. "I just didn't want Ruth to be hit," Emma said, her voice soft but clear. "She didn't do anything wrong," Victoria screamed. "She's lying. She attacked me first. Jackson, I'm your fiancé. You have to believe me." Jackson stayed silent. He looked at Victoria, then at Emma, then at the servants trembling all around them. He saw fear in their eyes, fear not of the new housekeeper but of Victoria. Just then William walked into the room. The old butler moved quickly, breathing hard, a stack of papers in his hand. He stopped when he saw the tension in the living room, but he didn't address it. He only looked at Jackson, his gaze loaded with meaning. "Sir," William said, "I need to speak with you in private right now." Jackson understood. His loyal butler never interrupted him unless it truly mattered. He nodded, then turned to Victoria. "Go to your room, we'll talk later." Victoria refused. She clutched Jackson's sleeve, tears streaming down her face. "No, Jackson, you have to throw that housekeeper out. She dared to touch me. She needs to be punished." Jackson gently pried her hand away. "I've said it, go to your room." "But Jackson," Victoria, just her name and nothing more. Yet Jackson's voice turned so cold the entire room could feel it. Victoria went still. She stared at Jackson, then at Emma, hatred burning in her eyes, but she didn't dare argue again. She turned and hurried out of the room. When Victoria was gone, Jackson faced Emma. "You," he said. "Stay." Emma looked up, startled. "I'm not firing you," Jackson continued. "You protected someone else. That isn't a crime." Then he turned to William and walked away, leaving Emma standing in the center of the living room with her heart racing. Ruth stepped forward on shaking legs and took Emma's hand. "Thank you," she whispered, her eyes bright with tears. "Thank you for protecting me." Emma looked at the older woman and gave her a small smile. "It's nothing, ma'am. I only did what was right." But inside her, a storm was rising. Jackson had looked at her, spoken to her, and in his eyes she'd seen something, a flicker of doubt, a question left unsaid. Did he recognize her? After 15 years, Emma didn't know. She only knew that from this moment on, everything had changed. She was no longer an invisible housekeeper. She had stepped into the line of sight, Jackson's, Victoria's, and William's. Meanwhile, in Jackson's office, William set the stack of papers on the desk. "Sir," he said, his voice heavy, I've been investigating for 2 years and I found this. Jackson looked down at the pages. His eyes widened. It was a printout of an email Victoria Sterling had sent to a private investigator 3 years earlier. That night Emma couldn't sleep. She lay on her bed, staring up at the black ceiling, her mind spinning with thoughts of Jackson, of the way he had looked at her, of Victoria and the hatred burning in her eyes, of the uncertain future waiting just ahead. Close to 2 in the morning, Emma decided to go down to the kitchen for a glass of water. She moved quietly through the dark hallway, careful not to make a sound. But when she pushed the kitchen door open, she stopped in surprise. The lights were still on. Ruth was sitting at the table, both hands wrapped around a cup of hot tea, her gaze fixed somewhere far away. "You're not asleep yet?" Emma asked softly. Ruth lifted her head and smiled when she saw her. "I'm old, I can't sleep much. And you, why are you still up at this hour?" Emma sat down across from her. "I can't sleep either." Ruth stood, poured another cup of hot tea and set it in front of Emma. "Drink, chamomile, it helps you sleep." Emma thanked her and took a small sip. The gentle fragrance spread through her, carrying a little warmth into the cold late-night air. They sat in silence for a while. Then Ruth spoke. "I have to thank you again," Ruth said, her voice trembling faintly. "In the 2 years I've worked here, nobody has ever dared to stand up for me. Everyone is afraid. I'm afraid too. But you weren't." Emma shook her head. "I'm not brave, ma'am. I just couldn't stand there and watch an innocent person get hit." "I've already—" She stopped, leaving the sentence unfinished. Ruth watched her, old eyes but sharp. "You've been through something like that, haven't you?" Emma was quiet for a moment, then she nodded. 3 years ago," she said softly. "I was working as a housekeeper in Chicago. The lady of the house abused the staff. I spoke up and I was framed, fired, smeared. Nobody believed me. After that, I learned that silence is the best way to survive." "Then why weren't you silent today?" Emma looked down at her tea. "I don't know. When I saw you about to be hit, I only thought of my foster mother. She's gentle like you. If anyone ever raised a hand to her, I'd never forgive myself for standing by and watching." Ruth rested her hand over Emma's and gave it a light pat. "Your foster mother," she asked gently. "How is she?" Emma felt her eyes sting. "She has cancer, late stage. I took this job because the pay is high so I can afford her treatment." "You poor thing," Ruth sighed. "So young and you've already carried so much." Emma tried to smile. "It's all right, I'm used to it." Ruth studied her for a long time, then spoke, her voice as light as breath. "You have the eyes of someone who suffered a great deal. I can see it. And that suffering didn't make you bitter, it made you more compassionate. That's something precious, my girl." Emma didn't answer. She only felt a tear slide down her cheek. Ruth stood and put a gentle arm around her shoulders. "No matter what happens, I'll stand with you," she said. "You're a good person. I believe that." The late night was quiet. 2 women sat in a warm kitchen, sharing pain and kindness in a world that could be cruel. Emma didn't know this would be the last peaceful moment before the storm arrived. The next morning, Jackson woke earlier than usual. He hadn't slept the night before. The email William had handed him kept circling in his mind, those cold lines appearing every time he closed his eyes. "I need every piece of information about the night Jackson Morgan was stabbed in 2009. About the alley, about the clinic, about the lullaby, about the red bracelet. I'll pay any price." Why would Victoria need to hire a private investigator to dig into her own memories? If she was truly the one who saved him, she should remember everything. She wouldn't need anyone to remind her. She wouldn't need to buy information. Jackson shook his head, trying to push the thoughts away. Maybe William was wrong. Maybe there was some misunderstanding. Victoria was his savior, the woman he loved. He couldn't doubt her over a single email. But the seed of suspicion had been planted, and it was already beginning to sprout. He stood at the window of his study, looking down at the garden below, and he saw her, the new housekeeper, Emma Carter. She was sweeping fallen leaves, a thin figure with light brown hair tied neatly at the nape of her neck. Jackson didn't know why he noticed her. There was something about her that drew his attention. Not beauty. She wasn't breathtaking the way Victoria was, but something in her eyes, a familiarity he couldn't explain. Then she began to sing. Her voice was small, almost a whisper. But the window was open and the wind carried the sound up to Jackson's ears. "Hush, little baby, don't say a word. Mama's gonna buy you a mockingbird." Jackson's heart began to beat faster. That song, the lullaby the girl from that rainy night had sung to him. He'd heard Victoria sing it hundreds of times, but something was different. Victoria sang the words correctly. This housekeeper, though, and if that horse and cart fall down, you'll still be the sweetest little baby in town. Wrong. She sang it wrong. In the right place at the right line, exactly the way the girl had sung it back then. Jackson felt as if someone had reached inside his chest and squeezed his heart until it couldn't breathe. He gripped the window frame, eyes fixed on the housekeeper singing in the garden. "Sir," William's voice sounded behind him. Jackson turned. The old butler stood in the doorway, his expression grave. "Do you have time to talk?" William asked. "About yesterday's email and a few other things." Jackson nodded. The two of them sat in the chairs in the study. "I've been investigating for 2 years," William began, his voice slow but steady. "From the day Miss Victoria appeared, I felt something wasn't right, but I didn't want to hurt you without proof." Jackson stayed silent, waiting. "Miss Victoria says she has a star-shaped birthmark behind her right ear like the girl from that night," William continued. "But I've watched carefully. For 2 years, she has no birthmark at all." "Maybe it faded with time," Jackson said, his voice uncertain. William shook his head. "Birthmarks don't fade, sir, and there's the email. Why would she need to hire a detective to investigate her own story? Why would she need to buy information about that night?" Jackson didn't answer. He didn't know what to say. "I can't claim anything for certain," William said, "but I think you should be careful, and there's one more thing." "What?" William looked Jackson straight in the eye. "The new housekeeper, Emma Carter. She knows the lullaby. She sings the wrong line in the right place, exactly as you've told me the girl from that night sang it." Jackson felt as if lightning had struck him. He turned his head back toward the window. Emma was still sweeping leaves in the garden, unaware she was standing at the center of a storm about to break. "You think?" Jackson whispered, his voice rough. "You think she is?" "I don't know," William said, "but I think you should find out." Jackson closed his eyes. His heart felt torn in two. On one side was Victoria, the woman he had loved for 3 years. On the other was the truth he was afraid to face. But he knew William was right. He had to find out, no matter how much the truth might hurt. The conversation between Jackson and William was cut off by the sound of the gate bell. Not the normal chime, but a rapid, relentless ringing, as if whoever was pressing it was desperate or furious. William stood and looked out the window. "Someone's demanding to come in. The guards are holding him back." Jackson rose as well. From the study window he saw a man standing at the gate, tall and lean, hair a tangled mess, clothes wrinkled as if he'd been traveling a long time. The man was shouting something at the guards, a thick file clutched in his hand. William's radio crackled. The guard's voice came through from the gate. "Sir William, there's a man insisting on seeing Miss Victoria Sterling. He says his name is Marcus Bennett. He won't leave. He says it's important, life or death." William looked at Jackson. Jackson frowned. Marcus Bennett. The name meant nothing to him. "He wants to see Victoria?" Jackson asked. "Yes, sir. He says he knew her 5 years ago. In Chicago." Chicago, the place Victoria claimed she had lived before coming to Lowe's Angels. Something tightened in Jackson's chest. "Let him in," Jackson ordered. William nodded and spoke into the radio. A few minutes later, the gate opened. Jackson and William went down to the living room. Victoria was already there, seated on the sofa, scrolling through her phone. She lifted her head when she saw Jackson. "Darling," she smiled sweetly. "What is it?" "Someone wants to see you," Jackson said. "Marcus Bennett." "Do you know him?" Victoria's reaction caught Jackson's attention. She sprang to her feet. Her face went pale in an instant. Her blue eyes widened, full of fear, but she recovered quickly, hiding it behind a strained, practiced smile. "Marcus Bennett, I don't know anyone by that name," she said, her voice faintly trembling. Jackson didn't miss the change, just a second, but long enough for him to see it. Victoria was lying. The living room doors opened. A guard escorted the man inside. Marcus Bennett was 34 years old, but he looked older. His eyes were bloodshot, heavy shadows under them as if he hadn't slept in days. His face was drawn, worn down by exhaustion and pain. But his gaze was sharp, cold, the gaze of a man carrying hatred like a blade. The moment he stepped into the room, Marcus's eyes locked on Victoria. He stared at her, jaw clenched, his fist crushing the file so hard his knuckles turned white. "You," Marcus said, the word hissing through his teeth. "I finally found you." Victoria took a step back. I don't know who you are. You've got the wrong person. Wrong. Marcus let out a harsh, bitter laugh. You think I'd forget your face after what you did to my sister? Jackson stepped forward, placing himself between them. Who are you and what do you want? Marcus turned to Jackson. Slowly, he pulled a crumpled newspaper from his coat, unfolded it, and held it out. It was the paper announcing Jackson and Victoria's wedding. Their photographs side by side, Victoria smiling brightly. I saw this last week, Marcus said, his voice thick with bitterness. I couldn't believe my eyes. The person who killed my sister is living like a queen about to marry a billionaire. He's lying, Victoria screamed. Jackson, don't listen to him, he's crazy. But Jackson didn't look at Victoria, he looked at Marcus. Killed your sister? Jackson asked slowly. What are you talking about? Marcus opened the file in his hands and pulled out a photograph, then gave it to Jackson. In the picture was a young woman around 22. Brown hair, brown eyes, a gentle smile, pretty in a simple, honest way. My sister, Marcus said, his voice catching. Sarah Bennett, 22 years old. She worked as a housekeeper for the Sterling family in Chicago 5 years ago. Jackson stared at the photo, then looked at Victoria. Her face was white as paper. Sterling, Jackson whispered, his voice turning deadly cold. I always knew there was a darkness behind your family name, Victoria, but I never imagined you were the one with blood on your hands. Victoria didn't answer. She stood shaking, lips moving but no words coming out. Marcus went on, his voice cutting like steel. Sarah worked for her family. She was beaten. She was tortured. Then one day Victoria accused Sarah of stealing. She pushed my sister down the stairs. He stopped, drew a deep breath, fighting to hold himself together. My sister suffered a brain injury. She was in the hospital for 3 days. Then she died. The room fell into a deadly silence. Jackson stood as if turned to stone. William held his breath. Servants hovering at the doorway covered their mouths in horror. And Victoria Sterling, the beautiful fiancée of the billionaire, stood trembling in the center of the living room as the dark past she tried to outrun finally caught up with her. Marcus pulled more documents from the file. His hands were shaking, but his voice stayed steady. This was the story he had replayed in his mind thousands of times over 5 years. This was the truth he had sworn to drag into the light. My sister Sarah, Marcus began, his voice thick with grief. She was the best girl I ever knew. 22 years old, just graduated college. She wanted to be a teacher, but my mother was seriously ill. We needed money for treatment. Sarah didn't have a choice. She had to work right away. He paused and swallowed. She got a job as a housekeeper for the Sterling family in Chicago, a wealthy family, high pay. Sarah thought it was good luck. She didn't know it was hell. Marcus took out a small notebook, the cover worn and frayed. This is Sarah's diary. She wrote in it every day. I found it after she died. He opened it and read aloud. March 12th. Miss Victoria hit me again today just because I looked her in the eye while speaking. She said I don't deserve to look at her. My cheek still hurts. Marcus turned a few pages. April 20th. Miss Victoria made me kneel for 2 hours because I spilled water on the floor. My knees are bruised. I want to quit, but Mom needs the money. I have to endure. Marcus's voice began to tremble. June 5th. Miss Victoria beat me with a clothes hanger because the cleaning wasn't done the way she wanted. My back is bleeding. I'm so scared. I'm so scared of her. He stopped reading. Tears ran down his face. Jackson stood motionless like a statue. He looked at Victoria. She was backing toward the corner of the room, face drained white, lips trembling. That's a lie, Victoria screamed. He made it all up. Jackson, don't believe him. Marcus didn't even look at her. He pulled more papers from the file. These are Sarah's messages to me, he said, handing Jackson a printed stack. The last messages she sent before the day she died. Jackson took them and read. Brother, I'm so scared. Miss Victoria is getting worse. Today she accused me of stealing a diamond ring. I didn't take it, I swear I didn't, but she won't believe me. She hit me. She said I have to confess or she'll kill me. Brother, what do I do? Jackson's hand tightened around the paper. He read the next message. Brother, I don't know how much longer I'll be alive. If something happens to me, remember this. Miss Victoria Sterling is the one who's hurting me. Promise me you'll get justice for me. Jackson lifted his head and looked at Marcus. What time was that message sent? He asked, his voice rough. 10 at night, Marcus replied. 6 hours later, Sarah was pushed down the stairs. Marcus pulled out another set of photos and laid them on the table. These are pictures of Sarah's bruises, taken at the hospital after she was brought into emergency. Jackson looked at the pictures and nausea rose in his throat. Sarah's back was covered in bruises piled over one another. Some were old, yellowing at the edges. Some were fresh, dark and purple. Her arms bore long lines like she'd been struck with a whip. Her face was swollen, one eye blackened. These weren't the injuries of a single fall down a staircase. These were the marks of prolonged abuse. The doctors said Sarah suffered a brain injury from the fall, Marcus went on, his voice cutting like a blade. But the other bruises, the doctors said those were older injuries, days old, weeks old, even months. He stared straight at Victoria, hatred burning in his eyes. My sister was tortured for 3 months working for your family, and that day when she refused to confess to a theft she never committed, you pushed her down the stairs. Victoria shook her head wildly. No, it was an accident. She fell, I didn't push her. Accident? Marcus roared. You call that an accident? My sister was in the hospital for 3 days. 3 days, she never woke up. My mother sat by her bed and cried until she had no tears left. Then Sarah died, 22 years old. She never got to live, never got to love, never got to be anything at all. Marcus's voice broke. And you know what your family did? They paid the hospital, they paid the police. They paid to silence everyone. They reported it as an accident. My sister died and nobody paid the price. The room sank into a heavy silence. The servants at the doorway were crying. Ruth covered her mouth, tears streaming down her face. Emma stood in a corner, her heart squeezed tight as if someone had wrapped a fist around it. She looked at Victoria and saw the devil behind the mask of an angel. William stood still, his face stone cold. But inside him, something was boiling. For 2 years he had suspected Victoria. For 2 years he had investigated, but he had never imagined the truth would be worse than anything he'd pictured. And Jackson stood in the middle of the room, the photos still in his hand, eyes fixed on nothing at all. He felt as if the whole world were collapsing beneath his feet. The woman he loved, the woman he believed had saved him, the woman he was going to marry, a killer. Slowly, Jackson turned his head toward Victoria. And for the first time in 3 years, he looked at her with the eyes of a stranger. Jackson couldn't stay in that room for another second. He turned and walked out of the living room without saying a word. He heard Victoria calling after him, her voice sharp with panic. But he didn't stop. He didn't turn back. He only kept moving faster and faster as if he were running from himself. He went up to the 2nd floor, down the long corridor, then pushed through a door and stepped onto the back balcony of the estate. The night wind cut cold across his face. Jackson stood there with both hands gripping the railing, staring down into the dark garden below. His chest hurt as if someone were crushing it in a fist. His mind spun with 1,000 thoughts. Victoria was a killer. She had tormented and killed an innocent young woman. She had hidden it for 5 years. And he had loved her, trusted her, planned to marry her. Jackson closed his eyes, fighting to hold back the pain tearing through his ribs. Then he felt it. The bracelet braided from red thread around his wrist, worn, faded, but still there after 15 years. Slowly, Jackson lifted his hand and looked down at it, and memory came rushing back like a flood. That rainy night, the dark alley, the pool of blood spreading on the ground. A 13-year-old boy dying, certain he was about to disappear. Then the girl appeared, thin, soaked through, light brown hair stuck to her face with rain. But her eyes shone in the darkness, eyes that refused to give up. He remembered how she sacrificed her only protection against the freezing cold just to keep his blood from spilling. She had dragged him through the rain, through the cold night to the clinic. She had sung to him while he was slipping into the dark. A trembling voice, the wrong words at the end, but warm, gentle enough to keep him tethered to life. Keep it. It'll bring you luck. Jackson remembered the moment she placed the red thread bracelet in his palm, remembered her sad but warm smile. Remembered the name she'd given him. Call me Star because I like looking at the stars. 15 years. Jackson had searched for her for 15 years, spent millions, hired countless investigators, all for the chance to find the person who had saved his life. Then Victoria had appeared with perfect proof, a story that seemed impossible to deny. He had believed she was his savior, and he had loved her because of it. But now he knew the truth. Victoria wasn't the one who saved him. Victoria was an imposter, a liar, a killer. 15 years, Jackson whispered, his voice raw. Have I been loving the wrong person? He stood there alone in the cold night, staring at the red thread as if he were staring into his own soul. Soft footsteps sounded behind him. William came to Jackson's side, standing next to him on the balcony. He didn't speak. He only stood there, silent, like a companion in the dark. The two men stood together, looking out into the night. At last, Jackson spoke, his words like an exhale. You know, William, I believed her. I believed her so much I would have died for her. William didn't answer. He only rested a hand on Jackson's shoulder and gave it a steady, supportive squeeze. And Jackson knew that tonight everything was going to change. The sound of an engine rose from the estate gate. Jackson and William turned to look down. An old car shot into the courtyard and stopped with a shriek of brakes. The door flew open. A man stumbled out and rushed toward the front entrance. Jackson recognized him at once. Robert Sterling, Victoria's father. A 58-year-old man Jackson had met a few times at family dinners. But tonight, Robert Sterling looked nothing like himself. His face was slick with sweat. His hair was wild. His clothes were rumpled as if he'd been wearing them for days without changing. He ran into the mansion, breathing hard, panic in every step. Jackson and William moved quickly downstairs. By the time they reached the living room, Robert Sterling was already there. He stood in the center of the room, staring at Marcus Bennett with fear in his eyes. Victoria ran to her father and grabbed his arm. Dad, tell them it was an accident. I didn't kill anyone. But Robert Sterling didn't look at his daughter. He looked at Jackson, and in his eyes Jackson saw something he hadn't expected. Guilt, regret, and surrender. Robert Sterling slowly sank to his knees. In the grand living room of the Morgan estate, the 58-year-old man knelt before Jackson, head bowed, shoulders trembling. Mr. Morgan, Robert said, his voice breaking. I'm sorry for everything, Victoria screamed. Dad, what are you doing? Get up. But Robert didn't rise. He lifted his face to Jackson, tears rolling down his cheeks. I hid my daughter's crime for 5 years, he said. I knew everything. I knew what she did to that girl, and I used money to silence everyone. Marcus Bennett stepped forward, fists clenched. You admit it. You admit you helped cover up my sister's death. Robert nodded, his voice full of pain. Yes, I admit it. He turned to Marcus, eyes red. 5 years ago, my family was on the edge of bankruptcy. My company was collapsing. Debts were piling up. I'd lost almost everything. All I had left was the house in Chicago and a little of my last savings. He paused and drew a deep breath. That night when the girl fell down the stairs, my daughter called me. She was frantic. She said she had pushed the housekeeper. She begged me to save her. Victoria shrieked. Dad, stop. Don't say any more. But Robert went on as if he hadn't heard her. I used my last money to buy silence. I paid the hospital. I paid the police. I paid the witnesses. I reported it as an accident. I covered it all up. He looked at Marcus, his voice shaking. Your sister died, and I helped my daughter escape. I was an accomplice, I know that. Marcus stood frozen. 5 years of searching for the truth, 5 years of fighting for justice. And now the man who had buried it was confessing in front of him. Jackson stepped closer, his voice cold as ice. Why did you hide it? Robert lifted his head to meet Jackson's gaze. Because my daughter begged me. Because I'm her father. Because I thought one mistake shouldn't destroy her entire life. He lowered his head. But I was wrong, completely wrong. That wasn't an accident, and it destroyed someone else's life. Victoria lunged toward her father, dropping to her knees beside him, gripping his shoulders and shaking him. Dad, you promised. You promised you'd never tell. You promised you'd protect me. Robert looked at his daughter, tears spilling down. I protected you for 5 years, but I can't protect you forever. The truth has to be spoken. Victoria screamed, her voice wild. It was an accident, Dad. Tell them I didn't mean it. I only pushed her a little. I didn't know she'd fall. Robert shook his head slowly, and what he said next made the entire room go still. No, Victoria, you meant to push her. Victoria went rigid. You told me that night, Robert continued, his voice raw with pain. You said you were angry because she wouldn't confess. You said you wanted to teach her a lesson. You said you pushed her hard. He closed his eyes as if he couldn't bear the weight of the memory. You pushed her at the top of the stairs. You watched her tumble down. You heard her head strike the steps, and you didn't call for help right away. You waited 30 minutes before you called. 30 minutes, Victoria. Those 30 minutes could have saved her. Victoria collapsed onto the floor, screaming through sobs. "No, no, you're lying, you betrayed me." Jackson stood watching. The woman he had planned to marry was on her knees, crying like a child, and he felt nothing. No pity, no heartbreak, nothing at all. He looked at her with eyes that were completely unfamiliar, as if he were looking at someone he had never known. 3 years, Jackson said, his voice flat with cold. 3 years you were by my side, and I never knew I was sleeping next to a killer. Victoria lifted her head, eyes red, face soaked in tears. "Jackson, I love you. I really love you. Please forgive me." Jackson didn't answer. He only turned away and walked out of the living room, leaving Victoria sobbing in despair behind him. Jackson hadn't even made it out of the room when William spoke up. "Sir, please wait a moment. There's one more thing you need to know." Jackson stopped. He turned back to the old butler. William was holding the stack of papers he'd brought the night before, the stack they hadn't had time to go through because Marcus Bennett had arrived. "What else?" Jackson asked, his voice exhausted. William stepped forward and set the papers on the table. "This is the evidence I've gathered over the past 2 years," he said. "About Miss Victoria, about how she came to you." Victoria lifted her head from the floor, eyes wide with terror. "No, William, you don't have the right." William didn't even look at her. He only looked at Jackson. "You should read this." Jackson took the stack. The first page was a printed email. He read, "Mr. Thompson, I need every piece of information about the night Jackson Morgan was stabbed in 2009. I need the location of the alley. I need to know which clinic received him. I need to know about the song someone sang to him. I need to know about the red bracelet. I'll pay double if you can get me the information within 1 week. Victoria Sterling." Jackson's heart felt like a fist had closed around it. He flipped to the next page. It was the detective's reply. "Miss Sterling, I found the information you requested. The alley is behind the apartment building at 523 Monroe Street, Detroit. The clinic is 2 blocks away." According to the hospital record, the victim arrived with severe blood loss and temporary bandaging made from cloth. There is no information about a song or a bracelet. However, I interviewed a nurse who worked that night. She remembers the victim repeatedly asking about a little girl, and on the victim's wrist there was a bracelet braided from red thread. Jackson could feel his legs beginning to shake. He kept reading. The next page was a receipt from a craft shop. 1 bracelet braided from red thread, requested to be aged, soaked in tea to fade the color. Customer, Victoria Sterling. Jackson went still. The red bracelet Victoria had handed him 3 years ago. The bracelet she claimed she'd kept for 12 years. The bracelet he had believed was proof no one could deny was fake, made to order from a description. Slowly, Jackson lifted his head and looked at Victoria. She was still kneeling on the floor, face white as paper, lips trembling without end. "You," Jackson said, his voice like a whisper from hell. "You lied to me for 3 years." Victoria shook her head wildly. "No, Jackson, I can explain." "Explain what?" Jackson cut in, his voice beginning to shake. "Explain hiring a detective to investigate the night I was stabbed. Explain ordering a fake red bracelet. Explain pretending to be my savior for 3 years." Victoria burst into tears. "Jackson, I love you. I really love you." "Love?" Jackson let out a bitter laugh. "You call that love? You lied to me. You used my pain. You pretended to be the one who saved my life just so I'd love you." He stepped closer, standing over Victoria, looking down at her with eyes cold as ice. "I spent 12 years searching for my savior. 12 years. You knew that, didn't you? You knew how badly I wanted to find the girl from that night, and you used it." Victoria looked up at him, tears streaming. "Because I knew you'd never love me if I wasn't your savior." The words hit the room like lightning. Everything went still. Victoria continued, her voice breaking. "I know you, Jackson. I know you don't trust anyone. You don't love anyone. Your heart froze the night you were abandoned. The only person you could ever love is the person who saved your life. The only person who could ever touch your heart is the little girl from that night." She sobbed hard. "I just wanted you to love me. I just wanted to be with you. I didn't have another way. If I didn't pretend to be your savior, you never would have looked at me." Jackson stood there staring at Victoria, and he felt hollow. 3 years. 3 years he had loved her. 3 years he had believed she was the angel who saved his life. 3 years he had cherished her like a treasure. All of it was a lie. "You're right," Jackson said, his voice flat with ice. I never would have loved you if you weren't my savior, but you know what? I also will never love a liar, a killer, a fraud down to the bone." He turned his back and started to walk away. "William, call the police," Victoria screamed after him. "Jackson, Jackson, don't leave me. I love you. I'm begging you." But Jackson didn't turn back. He walked out of the living room, leaving behind the wailing cries of the woman he had once loved. Victoria tried to scramble up and run after Jackson, but her heel caught on the hem of her dress and she went down hard on the floor. The phone tucked in her pocket flew out, skidded across the marble, and stopped at William's feet. The screen lit up. A message notification appeared. William bent to pick up the phone. His eyes swept over the line on the screen and he went utterly still. "Sir," William called after Jackson, his voice trembling. "You need to see this." Jackson stopped and turned. He came back and took the phone from William's hand. The message was from someone saved as Attorney Morrison. "Miss Sterling, the prenuptial agreement has been drafted. Per the terms, after 1 year of marriage, if a divorce occurs for any reason, you will receive 50% of Mr. Morgan's assets. I added the protective clause you requested. The plan is proceeding as intended." Jackson felt as if a knife had just been driven straight through his chest. He scrolled up and read the earlier messages. "Attorney Morrison, I need an ironclad prenuptial agreement. Make sure I get 50% of his assets if we divorce. Don't let him suspect anything." And another message. "Everything is going smoothly. He believes I'm his savior. Once we're married, it'll all be mine. Have the divorce papers ready after 1 year." Jackson finished reading and his hand began to shake. It wasn't only deception. It wasn't only impersonation. Victoria had planned to take his fortune from the beginning. Slowly he turned his head toward Victoria. She was still on the floor, eyes wide with terror as she saw the phone in Jackson's hand. She knew what he had read. "Jackson," she whispered, "I can explain." "Explain," Jackson cut in, his voice cold as ice. "Explain planning to marry me, take half my assets, then divorce me. Explain hiring a lawyer to draft a fraudulent contract. Explain how everything from start to finish was a scheme." Victoria went still. The silence in the room became heavy, crushing the last of her hope. She looked at Jackson, then at the evidence, and something inside her finally snapped. The mask of the grieving fiancé shattered into 1,000 pieces. Victoria didn't answer. She only stared at Jackson, tears pouring down her face, lips trembling. Then suddenly she laughed. A wild, bitter laugh. "A scheme? Yeah, fine, it was a scheme. From the beginning I wanted your money. I'm not your savior. I never really loved you. It was all for money." She pushed herself to her feet, eyes bloodshot, her voice sharp as a blade. "You think I wanted to be the wife of a billionaire. You think I like living in fear, never knowing when you'll get shot dead. I only needed money. Money so I'd never have to live like a dog again." Jackson watched her in silence. Victoria kept shouting as if she were vomiting up everything she'd kept locked away for years. "What do you know about me? What do you know about my life?" She let out a bitter laugh. "When I was 18, my father went bankrupt. One day I was a rich girl. The next I was the child of a drowning debtor. My friends turned their backs on me. The ones who used to flatter me suddenly laughed in my face. They called me a beggar girl, a girl with no future." Tears ran down her cheeks, but her voice stayed full of hatred. "My boyfriend, the boy I thought would stay with me forever, left the second he found out. He said he didn't love a poor girl. He said I wasn't worthy of him." Victoria closed her eyes, pain flooding back. That 18-year-old girl stood in the middle of a school courtyard, mocked by friends, abandoned by the boy she loved, turned away by the whole world. She cried until there was nothing left inside her. She wanted to die, but she didn't. She swore to herself she would never be poor again. Never. She would do anything to have money, anything. Victoria opened her eyes and stared straight at Jackson. "I lived in hell for 12 years. I did every job. I swallowed every humiliation just to survive. Then I heard about you, the billionaire searching for the savior from long ago, the man willing to give that savior everything." She gave a harsh smile. "I saw my chance. I took it. I don't regret it." Jackson stood there listening, and he understood. He understood what Victoria had been through. He understood why she had become what she was. He understood she was also a victim of circumstance, of poverty, of betrayal. But understanding wasn't forgiveness. "I understand," Jackson said, his voice low and tired. "I understand you suffered. I understand you were hurt, but that doesn't give you the right to kill. It doesn't give you the right to lie. It doesn't give you the right to destroy other people's lives." He looked Victoria straight in the eyes. Sarah Bennett was poor too, she suffered too. She worked as a housekeeper to care for a sick mother, but she didn't kill anyone, she didn't deceive anyone, she was only trying to live with decency, and you killed her. Victoria lowered her head. No words came. Jackson turned and walked away. "You chose your road," he said without looking back. "Now you live with the consequences." Victoria's crying rose behind him, but this time Jackson didn't stop. He didn't turn around, he didn't hesitate, because even if he understood her past, he still couldn't forgive her. Not ever. Jackson was about to walk out of the room when William spoke again. "Sir, please wait. There's one more thing, the most important thing." Jackson stopped and turned toward the old butler. William didn't look at him. He was looking toward the corner of the room where Emma stood in silence, head lowered as if she could make herself disappear. "Miss Carter," William said, gentle but clear. "Please come here." Emma startled. She lifted her head, eyes wide with surprise. "Me?" she asked, her voice trembling. "Do I have to do with this?" William didn't answer. He only watched her with those old, sharp eyes, the eyes of a man who had lived long enough to see straight through people. Emma hesitated, then slowly stepped forward into the center of the room. Jackson looked at her, the frail housekeeper with light brown hair and sorrowful eyes. The girl who had dared to hold Victoria's wrist to protect Ruth. The girl who felt strangely familiar to him. "Miss Carter," William said, "please show me behind your right ear." Emma went still. Her face blanched in an instant. Her hand rose without thinking, covering her ear. I don't understand what you want," she said, her voice shaking. Ruth suddenly spoke from behind them. "Emma," she said gently, "that song you sing when you work, that lullaby, where did you learn it?" Emma turned to the older cook, confusion in her eyes. "What song?" "Hush, little baby," Ruth said. "You sing it every day, and you sing the last part wrong." Jackson felt his heart begin to race. He stepped closer, stopping in front of Emma. She took a step back as if she was afraid of him. "You know that song?" Jackson asked, his voice rough. Emma didn't answer. She stood there, lips pressed tight, eyes fixed on the floor. Jackson drew a slow breath. Then he began to sing. His voice was low, trembling, almost a whisper. "Hush, little baby, don't say a word. Mama's gonna buy you a mockingbird." He stopped and looked at Emma. "Do you know the next part?" Emma lifted her eyes. Her gaze met Jackson's, and for that one breath of time it felt as if the world stopped. 15 years earlier. Rain, a dark alley, a boy dying, a thin little girl, and a lullaby. Emma opened her mouth. Her voice came out small, shaking, nearly swallowed by the air. "And if that mockingbird won't sing, Mama's gonna buy you a diamond ring." She kept singing line by line, word by word, until she reached the end. "And if that horse and cart fall down, you'll still be the sweetest little baby in town." Wrong words, right place, right line. Exactly like 15 years ago. Jackson stood frozen. He'd heard Victoria sing that song hundreds of times. She always sang it perfectly, the correct words, because she'd memorized it from whatever the detective had fed her. But the girl from that night hadn't sung it right. She'd sung it wrong because she hadn't learned it from a book. She'd only half remembered it from childhood. And the woman standing in front of him now sang it wrong too. In the same place, in the same way. "You," Jackson breathed, his voice barely there. "You are," William stepped in. He laid a gentle hand on Emma's shoulder. "Miss Carter," he said softly, "please allow me." Emma didn't resist. She stood as still as stone while William carefully swept her light brown hair aside, revealing the skin behind her right ear. And there it was, a star-shaped birthmark, small, light brown, sitting just behind her right ear. Jackson saw it, and it felt as if the air had been pulled from his lungs. 15 years. 15 years of searching, millions spent, investigators hired, streets walked, names asked. And she was here, right in front of him, working as a housekeeper in his own home. Jackson slowly dropped to his knees in the grand living room in front of everyone. The most powerful billionaire in Los Angeles knelt before a frail housekeeper. "You," he said, his voice breaking. "You were the little girl that night. You're the one who saved me." Emma looked down at him, tears beginning to slide down her cheeks. "Why didn't you tell me?" Jackson asked, his voice like a sob. "You knew who I was, you saw the red bracelet on my wrist, you knew Victoria was an imposter. Why didn't you say anything?" Emma stood there trembling, tears pouring down her face. She said, her voice cracking. I wanted to, but I didn't dare. Why? Emma closed her eyes as if she were trying to endure something too heavy to hold. Because nobody would believe me. Nobody ever believes me. Her voice broke with grief. I'm just a poor housekeeper and she's your fiancée. She's been by your side for 3 years. She has everything. What do I have? Only my memory. Who would believe me? Who would listen? Jackson stayed on his knees, looking up at her, his heart ripping open. 15 years. The girl who had saved him 15 years ago. And 15 years later, she still had nobody she could trust. Still alone, still left behind, just like he had been back then. Emma stood there looking down at Jackson on his knees before her, and she couldn't hold it in any more. The tears broke loose like a dam giving way, carrying with them all the suffering she'd kept hidden for so many years. You don't understand, she said, her voice choked. You don't know what my life has been. She wiped at her cheeks with the back of her hand, but the tears wouldn't stop. 3 years ago, I was a housekeeper for a family in Chicago. The mistress beat the staff every day. I saw it. I couldn't take it. I spoke up. Bitterness crept into her voice. And do you know what happened? She framed me for stealing. She fired me. She ruined my name everywhere. Nobody believed me, not one person. Emma closed her eyes as the memories came rushing back, sharp and bruising. I lost my job. I lost my reputation. I lost my faith in anything at all. So you see, Jackson, I had nothing but a memory. And in a world of power like yours, a housekeeper's memory isn't proof. It's a death sentence. After that, I learned that silence is the only way to survive. Don't speak. Don't accuse anyone. Don't hope anyone will believe you. She opened her eyes and looked at Jackson. When I came here, I recognized you immediately. I saw the red bracelet on your wrist. I knew Victoria was an imposter. I wanted to tell you. I wanted to so badly. Tears slid down her chin. But I was afraid. I was afraid it would happen again. What happened in Chicago? And my foster mother is very sick. I need this job. I need the money for her treatment. If I spoke up and nobody believed me, I'd be fired. My mother would die. I couldn't risk it. I couldn't. She broke into sobs. I'm sorry. I know I'm a coward. I know I should have said something sooner, but I couldn't. I was too afraid. Jackson stayed there listening to every word, and he understood. He understood what she had endured. He understood how deeply she had been hurt. He understood why she chose silence. Because she was like him once, alone, abandoned, unheard, disbelieved. Jackson slowly rose to his feet and stepped toward Emma. She retreated as if she expected him to blame her. But Jackson didn't blame her. He held her. In the grand living room, in front of everyone, the coldest billionaire in Lowe's angels pulled a frail housekeeper into his arms, and he cried. For the first time in 15 years, Jackson Morgan cried. Tears he had swallowed since the night his father left him bleeding in a dark alley. The tears he had buried while he built an empire with blood and other people's pain. The tears he'd thought had dried up long ago. They poured out now, down his cheeks onto Emma's shoulder. I've been searching for you for 15 years, Jackson whispered, his voice breaking. I spent millions, hired investigators, went everywhere, asked everyone. He held her tighter. And you were here, right in front of me, in my own house. Emma stood in Jackson's arms, trembling. She didn't know what to do, what to say. She only stood there and cried with him. You saved my life, Jackson said. You gave me the only warmth you had left on that godforsaken night. You were shivering, yet you stayed. You chose to save a stranger when the whole world had already left him to die. The entire room fell into silence. William stood there with reddened eyes, quietly wiping away tears. He'd been with Jackson for 13 years. He had never once seen his master cry until today. Ruth sobbed soundlessly, hand over her mouth. The other servants cried too. Marcus Bennett stood still, tears sliding down his face even though this wasn't his story. Even Robert Sterling lowered his head, not daring to look. Victoria was the only one who didn't cry. She stood in the corner, face white as bone, watching Jackson hold Emma with eyes full of hatred and despair. But nobody cared about her anymore. Because in the center of that room, two people had found each other again after 15 years. Jackson and Emma, the boy who had been abandoned and the girl who had saved him, the billionaire and the poor housekeeper. They held each other and cried for 15 years of distance, for everything they had suffered, for the moment they finally found their way back to each other. That night the police came to the Morgan estate. Jackson stood and watched as they put handcuffs on Victoria Sterling. She screamed and cried and begged, but he didn't soften. He had given her everything: love, trust, a future, and she had returned it with lies and deception. Marcus Bennett stood beside him, watching Victoria being led into the police car. For 5 years he had waited for this moment. For 5 years he had fought for justice for his sister, and at last justice was being served. Robert Sterling was taken as well for questioning. He was an accomplice in covering up Sarah Bennett's death. He would have to pay for his silence. When the police cars drove away, Jackson turned to look at Emma. She stood in the corner of the courtyard, thin and fragile as if a single gust of wind could blow her away. He walked to her. "Stay here tonight," he said gently. "We'll talk in the morning." Emma nodded without speaking. 1 week later, Jackson stood outside a hospital room looking through the glass. Inside, an older woman lay on the bed, her face pale but peaceful. Grace, Emma's foster mother. He had paid every hospital bill. He had hired the best doctors. He had made sure she received the best care possible. Emma stood beside him, eyes red. "I don't know how to thank you," she said, her voice thick with emotion. Jackson shook his head. "You don't need to thank me. 15 years ago, you saved my life. I owe you more than this." He reached into his pocket and took out something small. The bracelet, braided from red thread, worn, faded, yet still intact after 15 years. "You gave me this bracelet that night," Jackson said. "You told me it would bring me luck, and it did." He gently took Emma's hand and placed the bracelet into her palm. "Now I'm giving it back to you, along with the thank you I've owed you for 15 years. Emma looked down at the bracelet, tears sliding down her cheeks. "I have a proposal," Jackson continued. "Stay at the Morgan estate, not as a housekeeper, but as someone I want to truly know." Emma lifted her head, startled. "I don't want to rush," Jackson said. "I just want the chance to be near you, to understand you, to make up for 15 years you had to live alone." Emma looked at him for a long time. Then she smiled, her first smile since she'd come to the Morgan estate. "Yes," she said, "I'll stay." 6 months later, Victoria Sterling was sentenced to 15 years in prison for manslaughter, fraud, and conspiracy to seize assets. She wailed in the courtroom, but nobody pitied her. Justice had been done. Robert Sterling was sentenced to 3 years for concealing a crime. He lost everything: money, reputation, even his daughter. Marcus Bennett finally found peace. He built a new grave for his sister, brought fresh flowers every week. He began a new life, no longer crushed beneath the weight of the past. Grace recovered. A miracle happened. She was discharged and returned to live in a small, beautiful home Jackson had bought for her and Emma. As for Jackson and Emma, they didn't rush into love. They began with friendship, with trust, with long conversations late into the night. Jackson slowly opened up, less cold, less distant. Emma slowly grew more confident, no longer lowering her head to anyone. One night they sat on the mansion balcony watching the stars. "Do you remember?" Jackson asked. "That night you told me to call you Star because you liked looking at the stars." Emma smiled. "I remember. Back then I thought stars were the most beautiful thing in the world because they shine in the dark." Jackson looked at her, his eyes gentle. "You're like that too," he said. "You shone in my darkness." Emma gave a quiet laugh and didn't answer. She only rested her head on Jackson's shoulder and looked up at the sky filled with stars. And for the first time in a very long time, both of them felt peace. The story of Jackson and Emma teaches us that sometimes people spend their whole lives searching for something precious, not realizing it is standing right in front of them. Truth doesn't need makeup. Real love doesn't need an imposter. And kindness, no matter how small, will be repaid in its own time. If this story touched your heart, please subscribe to our channel, hit like, and share this video so more people can hear meaningful stories like this every day. How did this story make you feel? Did it remind